The night was a liquid sheet of black terror, swallowing every sliver of starlight, and the wind, roaring off the hills of Galilee, felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like the breath of some colossal, enraged beast. We had been rowing for hours, maybe 4, perhaps 5. Time ceases to have meaning when your lungs are burning and every muscle fiber screams betrayal. This was not a sudden squall, quickly spent. This was relentless, grinding devastation designed to wear down not just the boat's timbers, but the very marrow of the men inside it. John, usually so steady, had given up trying to bail the bilge. He just huddled, his face a ghostly gray beneath the spray, his eyes wide, reflecting nothing but the desperation that gripped us all. The waves were mountains now, dark emerald masses that lifted the little hull 40 feet into the air, only to drop it sickeningly into the trough, a dizzying cycle that destroyed all hope of finding an even rhythm. Every time the boat slammed down, a sound like a gunshot echoed through the wood, and for a heart-stopping second we waited for the splintering crack that would announce the end. Anxiety in that moment was not a distant worry about tomorrow's catch or next week's tax. It was physical, concrete, and immediate. It was the vice grip tightening around your chest, making the simple act of drawing breath feel like dragging lead weights into your lungs. It was the metallic taste of fear at the back of your throat, the involuntary tremor that shook your hands even when you grasped the tiller, the paralyzing knowledge that despite all your skill, all your strength, and all your experience on this treacherous lake, you were utterly, completely, and irrevocably helpless. We were seasoned fishermen. We knew this lake intimately. We knew its moods, its sudden rages, and its deceptive calms. But this night, it was unrecognizable. It was chaos given form, an existential threat that mocked our efforts. Matthew, huddled near the mast, began to recite the Shema, his voice thin and reedy, trying to find solace in ancient words, but the wind tore them away before they reached the gunwale. Simon Peter, who had been wrestling the oars with the ferocity of a caged lion, finally dropped them, his chest heaving, his eyes searching the surrounding darkness for a coastline that was miles away, invisible, and perhaps already submerged. He looked at James, and then at Andrew, and in the unspoken understanding that passed between them, the grim acknowledgement that they were facing the final moments, the true weight of their fate settled. They had abandoned everything to follow the Master, only to die here, in the middle of a cold, indifferent sea, forgotten by the very God they now served. This deep, profound sense of abandonment was the ultimate source of the terror, an anxiety far worse than the fear of drowning itself. It was the fear that their purpose, their faith, and their recent transformation were all for nothing, about to be extinguished in the dark water. The futility of their struggle became a psychological burden heavier than the oars themselves. They rowed not out of hope, but out of the sheer primal inability to surrender to death. Hours earlier, Jesus had sent them ahead, insisting they cross the water while he stayed behind to dismiss the crowds after the miracle of the loaves and fishes. That memory, the sight of thousands fed from 5 small barley loaves, should have been a source of immense comfort, a shield against despair. Yet, in the suffocating darkness, under the lash of the relentless wind, the miracle seemed like a distant dream, a pleasant fairy tale disconnected from their immediate, horrifying reality. They were alone, precisely where the Master had commanded them to go, and yet they felt utterly forsaken. Doubt began to creep in, insidious and cold, whispering accusations into the roaring wind. Was this a test? If it was, they were failing miserably. If he truly possessed such power, why had he left them to this? Why did his power not extend across the miles of tumultuous water to calm their hearts, if not the storm itself? Their anxiety was feeding on the silence of God. Every wave that crashed over the bow reinforced the painful realization that they were merely human flesh against the overwhelming, indifferent forces of nature. The cold penetrated their tunics and then their bones, chilling them to the point of numbness. Yet their minds remained razor-sharp, focused only on the absolute certainty of their demise. James, whose faith was usually the quiet, enduring kind, began to lament softly, weeping not for his own life, but for the future he would not see, the promised kingdom that would now rise without him. This collective despair, this shared realization that they had fought their last fight, created a heavy, oppressive atmosphere within the small boat, far more dangerous than the water filling the hull. It was the death of hope before the death of the body. Peter, recovering his breath, picked up a broken piece of wood and began smashing furiously at the water collected at his feet, a meaningless act of aggression against a limitless enemy. He hated this feeling, the utter loss of agency, the humiliation of being reduced to a terrified child. All his life he had been strong, decisive, the fisherman who conquered the Sea of Galilee. Now the sea was conquering him, humiliating him, exposing the fragility of his self-sufficiency. He looked toward the distant, unseen shore, trying to imagine the warmth of a fire, the smell of dry earth, the solid feel of ground beneath his feet. But the imagination failed, replaced by the crushing reality of the deep, cold blackness surrounding them, pulling them down. They had drifted far off course, swept southward by the gale. There was no point in rowing eastward toward the destination Jesus had named. They were merely surviving, breath by miserable breath, trapped in the eye of the physical and psychological storm.
It was in the fourth watch of the night, when human endurance was utterly spent and the first faint stirrings of dawn should have been approaching, that the vision appeared. The disciples were too exhausted, too submerged in their own paralyzing anxieties to process what their eyes were reporting. They had given up fighting the boat. They were simply waiting for the final catastrophic wave. John was the first to see it, catching a shape moving unnaturally against the darkest part of the churning water. He didn't speak immediately. His throat was too dry, his mind too fractured by fear to form coherent words. He simply pointed, a rigid, trembling finger aimed into the blackness off the starboard side. The others followed his gaze, squinting through the spray and the driving rain. At first, it looked like a pillar of mist, strangely compact, or perhaps a shadow cast by a wave. But as it moved closer, gliding effortlessly over the impossible mountainous peaks of water, a terrifying recognition dawned. It was human-shaped. Yet no boat was visible, and no mortal man could possibly withstand the churning violence of the gale while remaining upright. The sight did not bring relief. It brought the most profound, primal horror that religious Jews could experience, the manifestation of a spirit, a demonic entity, or an angel of death come to claim their souls before the water claimed their bodies. Their terror, which had been physical and focused on the elements, suddenly turned metaphysical. This was worse than drowning. Drowning was a physical end. This was a supernatural encounter, a confirmation that the world of the dead was reaching out to drag them down. Every man in the boat who saw the figure cried out simultaneously, not the strained, miserable cries of exhausted rowers, but high, desperate screams of pure, unadulterated spiritual dread. They recoiled from the apparition, huddling together in the center of the boat, forgetting the wind, forgetting the waves, focused only on the slow, deliberate approach of the figure walking on the surface of their watery grave. Their anxiety escalated instantaneously from a crisis of survival to a crisis of the soul. Luke, who was the youngest among them, buried his face in his hands, muttering ancient exorcisms that he barely remembered, hoping they held some protective power against the approaching phantom. Simon Peter, who moments before had been ready to fight the entire ocean, was now utterly frozen, his bravado melted away by the chilling certainty that this was the end of all things, the final moment of reckoning. He felt the cold, hard certainty of fate wrapping around him, suffocating him not with water, but with the paralyzing realization that they were trespassers on sacred, dangerous ground. The figure drew nearer, still silent, still unnerving in its perfect stability amidst the utter chaos. They could now make out the dark, flowing robes, the unmistakable human outline. The fear was so intense it bordered on delirium. Some believed it was the ghost of Judas Maccabeus, a hero returning to punish them for some unknown transgression. Others feared it was Leviathan, rising from the deep in human form. This anxiety of the unknown, the fear of the invisible world suddenly made visible, eclipsed all their earthly concerns. It was the moment they ceased being men fighting a storm and became souls witnessing a horrific impossibility. The figure continued its approach, utterly indifferent to the violence of the storm, moving with the measured pace of someone walking on a quiet beach rather than conquering a raging sea. The disciples, bound together by their shared transcendent terror, could only watch, their breath catching in their throats with every impossible step the figure took. They tried to retreat, their instinct screaming to put distance between themselves and this phantom, but the storm held them fast, pushing them into the entity's path. Andrew frantically tried to grab the oars again, not to row away, but simply to have some tool, some tangible means of defense against the encroaching dread, but his hand shook too violently to grasp the wet wood. The boat was already too deep in the water, rocking wildly, making any effort to maneuver futile. They were pinned down, trapped by the relentless forces of nature and the unkerning certainty of supernatural malice. The wind howled a counterpoint to their silent terror, ripping through the rigging, amplifying the feeling of exposure and vulnerability. They were not just facing a ghost, they were facing a force that defied the laws of their reality, and that defiance was frightening in its absolute power. This moment of paralyzed fear was perhaps the most acute suffering they had endured all night. When you fight the elements, you can exhaust yourself, but you feel useful. When you face something utterly inexplicable, utterly dominant, you are reduced to nothingness, your will broken, your very sanity questioned. It was the anxiety of insignificance. James looked wildly toward Peter, expecting the strong fisherman to take charge, to somehow find a solution. But Peter's face was a mask of rigid horror, his eyes fixed, unblinking on the advancing shape. His massive strength was useless here. No net could catch a ghost, no oar could fight an apparition. The storm raged outside their boat, but the true hurricane now swirled inside their minds, tearing apart their foundations of belief and reason. They were waiting for the phantom to stretch out a cold, watery hand and drag them down one by one into the abyssal depths. The failure to escape, the sheer physical impossibility of maneuvering the waterlogged boat against the gale drove home the finality of their situation. Every instinct they possessed screamed, "Run!" but their bodies were trapped. They were watching their own death approach them across the water. The figure was now perilously close, close enough that in the momentary illumination of a flash of lightning, they saw the flowing movement of the garment, the natural posture of the head, and something about the shoulders, the stance, that felt hauntingly familiar, yet terrifyingly wrong. The familiarity only amplified the terror. It was a perversion of the known world. It was then, precisely when their collective terror reached its absolute screaming peak, when every man was convinced that the next second would be their last, that the figure stopped, stabilizing the chaos around it, and spoke.
The voice cut through the sound of the wind and the wave crash with an authority that was shocking in its quietness. It was not a shout designed to pierce the gale. It was a voice meant only for their ears, a steady, measured resonance that seemed to originate not from the figure's throat, but from the very core of the storm itself. It was the voice of command, yet infused with an overwhelming gentleness. A familiarity that instantly triggered a cascade of conflicting emotions in the paralyzed disciples. They heard 3 words, spoken into the heart of their absolute, paralyzing anxiety crisis, and those 3 words shattered the demonic illusion of the spirit. The figure spoke, and the terrifying supernatural specter was instantly replaced by the warmth of recognition. The words were, "Take heart, it is I. Tharseti, ego imi." 3 simple words, yet they held the power of creation, the weight of history, and the intimacy of friendship. Take heart. A command not merely to cease fearing, but to reclaim their courage, to remember the hope they had almost lost. It is I. In the Greek, ego imi, the divine declaration, the name reserved for the God who spoke through the burning bush. It was the ultimate, authoritative affirmation of presence, identity, and sovereignty over the very elements trying to destroy them. The figure was not a ghost, but their master. He was not a judge come to claim them, but their shepherd come to rescue them. The realization crashed over the boat like a wave of pure relief, washing away the paralyzing terror and replacing it with stunned awe. For the modern soul, wrestling with anxiety, with the relentless feeling of being tossed about by unseen, overwhelming forces, financial ruin, chronic illness, pervasive loneliness, isn't this the same chaos? The same feeling of being abandoned in the 4th watch of the night? We look out into our own storms and see not a path to safety, but only frightening phantoms. The phantom of failure, the ghost of past trauma, the specter of an unknowable future. We scream because the wind of our circumstances is too loud, and we feel utterly alone, convinced that whatever is approaching is hostile, ready to drag us under. But what if the voice that cuts through your darkest hour, through the noise of despair and the crashing waves of fear, speaks those very same words? What if the overwhelming power that defies the laws of nature, the power that you dread, is not an enemy, but the very presence of perfect peace? I want you to stop right now, just for a moment, and reflect deeply on your own current storm. What is the biggest phantom you see walking toward you on the waves of your anxiety? Is it debt? Is it illness? Is it regret? And if you could hear those 3 words whispered directly into your deepest dread, take heart, it is I. What would change in that instant? Share your thoughts in the comments below. How does hearing that authoritative voice of presence alter the nature of your fear? Because understanding the difference, crucial turning point, just as it was for the men in the boat. The moment those 3 words resonated across the water, the chaos did not cease instantly, but the terror did. The psychological climate inside the boat shifted seismically. Fear, the paralyzing dread of the supernatural, vaporized, leaving behind a profound sense of shock and immediate, overwhelming security. It was the ultimate contradiction. The storm still raged, yet they were safe. The wind still howled, yet they were anchored by the simple, authoritative presence of their master. Peter, whose anxiety had morphed seamlessly into courage throughout his life, was the first to fully process the implication of the sight before them. If that figure was Jesus, and if he was capable of neutralizing the very laws of physics simply by existing upon them, then the entire structure of the world had changed. The limitations that had bound Peter, gravity, danger, exhaustion, and fear, were suddenly revealed as optional constraints. His heart, which moments before had been a frantic drumbeat of impending doom, now surged with a manic, immediate faith that bordered on recklessness. He wasn't thinking rationally. He was experiencing the dizzying high of sudden, absolute deliverance. He looked at Jesus, still standing impossibly firm on the turbulent water, and felt an audacious, irrepressible urge to join him, to test the boundaries of this new reality. He had to know if the miracle was localized only to the Master, or if faith, even his flawed, impulsive faith, could grant him access to the same divine power. Ignoring the gasps of the other disciples, who were still recovering from the shock, Peter called out, his voice now strong despite the wind, demanding proof, demanding participation. "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." This was not merely an act of faith. It was an attempt to prove to himself, after the humiliation of his paralyzing fear, that he was worthy of this miraculous reprieve. Jesus' response was immediate and utterly simple, containing only one word that served as both permission and command. "Come." Peter did not hesitate. He threw his leg over the gunwale, his heart pounding not from fear this time, but from the adrenaline of absolute commitment. He was leaving the supposed safety of the boat, the familiar territory of wood and wave, to step onto the impossibly unstable surface of the water, stepping directly out of the domain of natural law and into the realm of radical possibility. As he stood and placed his first foot on the liquid surface, a hush fell over the immediate area around him. The water held. It did not sink or absorb him. It remained firm, pliable, yet solid beneath the weight of his fisherman's boot. For that glorious, fleeting moment, Peter knew a sense of triumph and deliverance that erased every hour of terror he had just endured. He was walking on water. He was defying the impossible simply by trusting the 3 words he had just heard. "Take heart, it is I." The world had turned upside down, and for the first time in his life, Peter felt truly, completely free from the constraints of fear.
Peter took one step, then another, his eyes locked on the figure of Jesus, the only anchor in his newly destabilized world. The sensation was profoundly strange. The surface beneath his feet was not hard like wood or rock, but possessed a subtle yielding quality, like walking on tightly stretched leather, yet it supported his full weight. With every stride, the distance between him and the boat grew, and the impossibility of his situation intensified the euphoria coursing through him. He was a man suspended between heaven and earth, held up purely by the tensile strength of his belief.
He was no longer the terrified fisherman who had screamed in the bilge. He was a walking testament to the Master's authority. This initial phase was pure, unadulterated faith, absolute focus on the source of the command. His vision was tunneled, excluding the peripheral chaos of the storm. He was seeing only Jesus, hearing only the silent resonance of the three powerful words that had granted him this impossible freedom. This is the moment when faith truly conquers anxiety, when the external noise of the crisis fades away and all attention is directed toward the authoritative presence of God. Peter walked about 10 paces, perhaps 15. He was halfway between the boat and the Master, an island of miraculous stability surrounded by the raging tempest. Then the inevitable happened. His human focus, inherently flawed and distracted, wavered. Perhaps it was a particularly violent gust of wind that whipped his hair across his eyes, or the thunderous roar of a wave crashing nearby, sending a plume of spray higher than his head. He allowed his peripheral vision to betray him. He took his eyes off Jesus and looked down. He saw the water, churning, furious, deep and utterly indifferent to the miracle sustaining him. He saw the height of the waves, the sheer, unimaginable violence of the gale, and the staggering weight of the impossibility he was attempting. He heard the wind not as a background hum, but as a direct, mocking challenge to his audacity. The cold, raw, sensory reality of the storm rushed back in, overwhelming the simple, quiet truth of the Master's command. Doubt, an insidious poison, found the tiniest crack in his resolve and flooded his entire being. It was not a reasoned doubt, it was an instinctive, biological panic. His mind screamed a simple, horrifying truth. Men do not walk on water. The moment Peter prioritized the sight and sound of the storm over the authority of the presence standing before him, the miracle began to dissolve. Anxiety, in the New Testament sense, is often defined as being torn between two masters, or having a divided mind, merimnao. Peter's mind split instantly between the visible chaos and the invisible promise. His focus was fatally divided.
The transition from walking on water to sinking was terrifyingly instantaneous. 1 second, he was firm. The next, his foot plunged through the water's surface as if it were nothing more than thin air. It wasn't a slow immersion. It was a sudden, violent realization of gravity and physics reasserting their dominion. The cold, dark, suffocating water rushed up to meet him, first soaking his ankle, then his calf, then his waist. The shock of the freezing water hitting his skin snapped him out of his momentary trance, but only to plunge him into a renewed, thousandfold worse panic. This wasn't just physical sinking. It was the psychological crash of failed faith, the bitter shame of having been given a divine privilege and having squandered it through doubt. The fear that rushed back was more intense than the initial terror in the boat, because now it was layered with guilt and the bitter taste of failure. He felt the terrifying realization of drowning, the constriction, the inability to breathe deeply, the blinding cold chaos of the water closing over his head. His arms flailed uselessly, desperate to find purchase, to grasp the air he had so arrogantly abandoned moments before. He was sinking rapidly, pulled down by the weight of his fear and the sheer density of the unforgiving sea. He was drowning not because the water was stronger than Jesus, but because his own doubt had proven stronger than his momentary faith.
The waves, which had seemed to respect him just a moment ago, now crashed over his head, swallowing his cries. He was utterly alone, suspended between the surface and the deep, facing certain death as a direct consequence of his distraction. In that final, desperate moment, with the water already closing over his mouth and the sounds of the storm muffled by the liquid chaos, Peter did not try to analyze his mistake, nor did he attempt to muster some final, glorious act of self-rescue. All his pride, all his strength, all his human complexity dissolved into one primal, guttural, three-word cry. A cry that transcended theology or philosophy, a cry of absolute childlike dependence on the very presence he had just doubted. He screamed, "Lord, save me!" This scream was the ultimate confession of helplessness, the admission that the solution to his crisis was entirely external to himself. It was the complete relinquishing of self-reliance, the final surrender to the authority of the one who had commanded him to come. The panic was absolute, but the cry was pure faith, distilled to its most basic requirement. I cannot do this, but you can.
Jesus did not wait. There was no hesitation, no pause for judgment or rebuke while Peter struggled. The response was immediate, an instantaneous reach across the remaining distance. A hand, strong and utterly steady, shot out, grasped Peter's wrist firmly, and hauled him upward out of the drowning depth. The rescue was not a slow, gentle pull. It was a decisive, powerful snatching from the jaws of chaos. The moment Jesus' hand closed around Peter's flesh, the violent, cold terror that had consumed him vanished. Peter was instantly stabilized, suspended above the raging waves, not by his own faith, but by the tangible physical power of the Master. As Jesus held him, Peter coughed and choked, spluttering the cold salt water from his lungs, his body shaking uncontrollably from the shock and the sudden infusion of relief. The world was still raging, the wind still screaming, but the central point of the storm, the space between Jesus and Peter, was an oasis of calm, held together by that singular, unwavering grasp. As soon as Peter was steady, standing awkwardly on the water beside him, Jesus spoke, his tone containing a gentle disappointment, a firm rebuke, but absolutely no condemnation. He looked at Peter, not with anger, but with profound understanding of human fragility. He used only 7 words, which served as the coda to the 3 words that had initiated the miracle. "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" The answer, of course, was embedded in the question. Peter doubted because he had shifted his focus from the power that commanded the world to the chaos of the world itself. He had forgotten the 3 words of presence, "Take heart, it is I." The lesson was brutally clear. Faith is not the ability to ignore the storm, but the ability to focus solely on the one standing within it. Then, holding Peter firmly by the shoulder, Jesus simply turned and began to walk, leading the shaken disciple back toward the boat. They walked the remaining distance together, 2 figures in the middle of a collapsing storm, one upheld by divinity, the other by divine contact. The storm did not stop immediately for them, but it ceased to matter. They reached the boat, and as soon as their feet touched the wood and they stepped over the gunwale, the world changed completely. The moment Jesus entered the vessel, the wind dropped abruptly, as if a colossal hand had snatched it away. The waves instantly subsided, transforming the turbulent sea into a glass-like surface, reflecting the astonished faces of the disciples.
The transition from near-death chaos to absolute peace was so sudden, so complete, that it felt like an edited cut in time. The disciples who had witnessed the feeding of thousands and the casting out of demons were now utterly broken by this final, complete demonstration of power over nature and over the anxiety of man. They fell to their knees in the rocking boat, their exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a profound, reverent awe.
The disciples lay prostrate, drenched and shivering, not just from the cold, but from the raw, exposed reality of the miracle they had just witnessed. They murmured their worship, acknowledging him not just as a prophet or a teacher, but as the true Son of God, the one whose presence alone could nullify the raging forces of the natural world. Peter, slumped in the bow, was unable to speak, his relief too vast, his shame too present. He looked at his hands, still trembling, recalling the feel of the water closing over his head, and then the iron grip of the Master pulling him up. He understood then, with a crushing clarity, that his failure was not a failure of strength, but a failure of sight. He had been given the answer, "Take heart, it is I," and yet he had allowed the overwhelming sensory input of the storm to eclipse the truth of the speaker. Anxiety, he realized, was simply prioritizing the visible disaster over the invisible authority. The boat drifted quietly on the now silent water, the black sky beginning to soften with the promise of dawn. The air was still, clean, and smelled only of damp wood and clean lake water. The profound peace that had descended was not just external. It penetrated the very souls of the men, soothing the raw edges of their fear and exhaustion. They sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of the 3 words that had saved them. Take heart was the call to emotional stability. It is was the authoritative claim of reality. I was the intimate promise of presence. The combination was the perfect antidote to despair, the perfect end to an anxiety crisis. It addressed the fear of the physical, take heart, the fear of the unknown, it is, and the fear of abandonment, I. The journey that had started with a desperate command to row now ended in a quiet, humbling act of worship. The storm had served its purpose, not to destroy them, but to reveal the limitations of human effort and the boundlessness of divine presence. They realized that Jesus had not been absent while they struggled. He had been waiting, watching, allowing them to exhaust their own strength so that they might fully appreciate the moment of salvation. The entire night had been a lesson in sovereignty. The Master had orchestrated the storm, or at least allowed it, knowing precisely when to intervene, knowing the exact 3 words required to shift their terror to faith. He had walked toward them in the most frightening disguise possible, a phantom, to force them to confront whether they feared the chaos or the one who commanded it. The moment they recognized his voice, the ghost of fear dissolved. The boat finally reached the quiet shore in the early morning light, gliding smoothly onto the sand. They disembarked, their legs unsteady, yet their spirits profoundly, irrevocably changed. They had faced their absolute end and been rescued by a voice and a hand that defied the world.